and welcome to Murphy's Garden. In this video I just want to sort of reflect on the evolution of our garden. I want to share with you some of the old photographs that we've got of where the garden was when we first moved in, and just share with you some of the tips and the experience that I've learned over the 12 years of being here. So the garden itself totals about an acre now, but when we first moved in it was half an acre, and then we subsequently bought a little paddock from a farmer, and the garden is now the size it is now, which is an acre. So when we first moved here 12 years ago, we were complete novices. We'd never taken on a project like this in the past, and we were both working full-time and we had 2 young children. So it was very much a case of fitting in gardening around all those other responsibilities, but getting the children involved from a really early age has been lovely. And although projects have taken quite a bit longer than if you would have got somebody in to do it, it's been so much more rewarding, and I think we've all gained something from it. We've all learned lots of new skills, and we've just got that satisfaction in knowing that we have done everything we've done, we have done it. So I certainly don't claim to be a garden designer, but I just hopefully want to inspire any of you who haven't done much gardening just to have a go. Everything I've done here and we've done as a family, we've just learnt on the job, and we've made lots of mistakes, but I can honestly say that's the best way of learning. So I hope to inspire people out there just to have a go and see what you can achieve. So before we have a look at some of the projects that we have tackled, I'm just going to share with you some of the projects that we've still to do. So this is the front of our garden, and as you can see, we've got this rather large circle of grass surrounded by concrete. And the story with this is that the previous owner had it as a swimming pool, which seems rather odd in a country farm to have a swimming pool, but they obviously had sort of illusions of grandeur. So we've got pictures of the swimming pool of what it looked like. It did look quite grim, but perhaps in its day it looked nice, I don't know. But as it is now, it's filled in with grass, and it's surrounded by this concrete. The concrete's all broken and it just looks really horrible. So this has been a project we've been putting off because it is a big project, but it's one that we really must get to because it's the first impression you get of the property when visitors come. So we want to do something about just improving the curb appeal and just making the whole thing look nicer. So that's a project for the future. So this little area is surrounded by this lovely little brick wall, and it's so sweet and contained, and it feels really nice. And when we first moved into the property, the first job that we did was to clear all this area. This area was full of like big overgrown trees and things, and we took them out. We had a tree surgeon take them down and we ground out the stump, and then we used this in the first few years to grow some vegetables. It wasn't ideal because it doesn't get the sun all day, but it did us for the first few years. But what I use it for now, we have got aspirations to make this into a little courtyard. It could be really lovely. We've got this lovely little, we call it the potting shed, which has got a window on that side, but it would be really lovely to have a little window in here and just make that the focal point of this area. But in the meantime, this area is very useful for bringing on stock. So plants that we have in other parts of the garden, we just buy in things and just bring them on. I've got lots of, they've got these box trees and things, and I've got all sorts of things. I've got a bay tree that had 2 lovely bay trees either side of the front door, and one of them got killed by the frost, but the other one's still alive, so that's coming on a bit. I've got a standard unanimous, and again its partner got killed in the frost, but I've still got that one. I've got these amilanchias, and I've got these cork oaks, which I want to use at the front. So all of these plants are really useful, and we've also got some yew. So any hedging jobs that I know I'm coming up, I just buy the small hedges and bring them on and ready for whenever we start to plant in the autumn. I've even got in this area, I've got some grasses. I've got this new area that I'm planning. So I bought these grasses. I'll just show you them. And I bought 3 plants and I've split them, and I've managed to create, I don't know, about 12 plants by just splitting them and then just bringing them on a bit. So that's ready for another project. So it's just a really economical way of just keeping the cost down, really. So that's one I'd really recommend. So obviously not everybody has the benefit of a big area like this, but even if you've got a small area in the garden, if you're just starting out and you're just starting to design the garden, if you just create just a small bed, it can be quite rough ground, and just set that aside and then bring on things. So even like like a box hedging. If you've got access to some box, just get some box, strip it off like that, stick it in the soil and leave them all in a little row, bring them on a bit, and then keep them well watered, and then by the time you come to do an area in the garden, you've got access to some box plants, which have cost you absolutely nothing, and it's just a little bit of time, but if you put the time in early on, then you'll have that benefit later on down the line. So a lot of garden designers recommend that when you take on a new garden is to sit down and plan out the garden, draw it all out, look at the aspect, look at the soil, look at all those things, and then carefully plan out your garden and then build on it year by year, keep building on that. Well, we didn't do it like that, we did it probably all wrong, but the way we did it was just to sort of chip away at little bits. So we decided to put the patio in, and we wanted a wide patio opening up to this apron here, and this was going to be our seating area. So we did all that, and we put in we had these sleepers that were left over from something else, so we decided we'd put these sleepers in and we'd have them as a raised border with lots of planting coming out and trellis behind with things growing up it. And we put the pond in, and put the sleepers in, and then very quickly thought that could actually make quite a nice pond. So we changed the spec halfway through, got the pond liner in and filled it, and it's become a pond. It was quite modern looking with it being made of sleepers, which I didn't know whether that would work, but I think over the years with the planting around it, it sort of softened it, and it has kind of meant that it sort of fits in. We did have trellis. The trellis ran up this part and then came at right angles behind the pond, and that just didn't look right at all. It really jarred. It's never a good idea to have trellis running at right angles, so we removed that. And then the other problem is we had the big table here, big glass table to eat at, but we very quickly realised that it was so windy. It seems to be a very windy part of the garden, and it just wasn't pleasant to sit in at all. So that's something, it's a good idea to sort of establish that perhaps prior to building the patio. But anyway, you live and learn. And since that, we've now put in structures. We've got the trellis running right up to the end, which really slows the wind down. And it's actually quite a nice, tranquil little area, and it has got the water, and it's actually a cooler part of the garden. So we find that if it is very hot in the summer, this is quite a nice place to come and sit and get away from the heat of the day. So it is incredibly daunting when you take on a new garden. For us, there was very few structures in the garden. Although it was a large farmhouse, the garden itself there really was a blank canvas. It was just grass. It had some old conifers. It did have one nice tree, which we thought we would keep, but then find out when the tree surgeon came that it was all cankered and it needed to come out. So it really was a completely blank canvas, which in some ways was good because it meant that we had a free rein to do whatever we wanted. Now, I had no background of any gardening background whatsoever. The previous house we'd lived in, which was in Lincolnshire, it was a new build, a fairly new house, and the person who had it before us had actually got a garden designer in to design it. It was only tiny, but it was all made of circles. It was nice little pathways. It was on different levels, and it had little pathways, and it had this little journey through the garden, which I remember when the kids were little, holding their hand, going up some little steps and round, and it really sort of reinforced the need to have a journey. The garden must have some sort of journey, some destination, and that definitely inspired me to try and recreate that in this garden. So this is the area, I think it's probably the first area that we actually designed, and it was some sort of intention that went into it. And we were inspired by visiting a garden locally. It's a garden called Woolerton Old Hall, which is in Shropshire. It's absolutely beautiful, and came home fired up and ready to try and sort of copy it, and which we sort of did in this area. So we found out the trees that they had grown were these Portuguese laurels, so we sourced them and we ordered them and they came. One of the issues we had different levels, so we had this kind of weird slope from the one area down to here, and we had these borders which were on a kind of weird slope. So we needed to address that, so we used these sleepers just to terrace it and to create borders, and then steps down to this sunken area. And I do like having the changes in height. It really is nice. Yeah, so then we got these laurel trees. Now in this area there was a great big, it was an old pond, there was no water in it, but it was all concrete. There was a big concrete basin, and then there was some sort of water feature thing that sort of went under the tree. So we had to chip away, we had a concrete breaker, and we had to chip away at all the concrete and dig it all out. It was a nightmare. And then when we put in these trees, every time we put the spade in to dig these holes, we kept hitting more and more concrete. So we eventually got there, and we obviously got the trees in, and they're thriving, they're doing really well. But yeah, it wasn't easy. And then this area led on to what was the children's playhouse. So this area behind me, we had quite a lot of old conifers. I think it had probably been a hedge because they were all in a line, but obviously they hadn't been cut and they'd got really big. We had one which had this, well, that was over the woodland area, but it had this lovely bark that kind of went up. And Joshua used to climb the conifers as well, so that was quite fun, and I was a bit loath to take them down because he quite liked climbing them. But anyway, we decided to get shots of them, and I'm really glad we did. We have replaced it with these lime trees, and we just cleared out a lot of the planting that was in here, which was just untidy. You might notice behind me it's looking quite bare because I've just removed some of the grasses, and I've got some new ones on order which I'll be putting in their place. But yeah, this area underwent a lot of change. You can see some of the old tree stumps, but this box hedge, talking about bringing on plants, this was all done by cuttings. And I remember Alistair's auntie at the time telling me how to take box cuttings, and she told me what to do when I was doing it, and she said, now in about 3 or 4 years you'll have a nice hedge. And at the time, 3 or 4 years, I can't wait that long. But you realise that as you get older and as you've been gardening, that 3 or 4 years just flies by. So you may as well just start the hedging off, and it's so rewarding to see it growing and to see that you have created it from nothing. So it is worth doing, and I know when you're young you get very impatient. I wanted everything now, but you do learn. Gardening definitely teaches you patience. So this is our little woodland area, and it has evolved over the years, and I'm really pleased with how it's looking. It's really maturing. But when we first started it, when we first tried to design it, we didn't have much of a budget. So we had these old stones that we found under the privet hedge when we came to remove the privet hedge. And there were quite a lot of them, and we also had stones from other parts of the garden. So we used them just to create a path, and it was quite a fun way of just experimenting. Obviously you could keep moving them, try different methods and different routes through the garden. So that's a really good tip if you haven't got the budget, but you want to sort of start the garden and get the feel of the garden. You want to create perhaps curved paths. If you do that, just use stones, infill it with bark, which will eventually mulch down. And then perhaps in the future, when you've got more of a budget, you could then put stone, paving or whatever it is that you want in the long term, which is more expensive. You could do that in the longer term, but at least you can start the planting, you can start getting the feel for the design that you want. So previously the woodland garden was made up of mostly conifers. Well, the downside with the conifers is that it's just dark, they dry out the soil underneath, and it's very limited what you could grow beneath. So when we did sort of bite the bullet and finally remove the conifers, we replaced them with these Betula Giacomonte, the silver birch, and it creates this lovely, very light canopy. So you get the feeling of sort of dappled shade, but without it being heavy. And with it being deciduous, you can plant all the spring bulbs and the spring plants beneath it, which look lovely. So yes, I definitely recommend these as opposed to conifer. So this area has undergone a huge amount of change. It's actually quite hard to remember how it was, but I believe, not here, further up there, that was where the privet hedge was. And then there was just a fence. In fact, this was the end of our garden, where there was a fence that ran. We had our compost bins down there. The fence just ran along here. We had an area of kind of scrubland, and then the fence. So that was the end of our garden. It was only later did we buy we bought this paddock off the farmer and made that part of the garden as well. But our garden ended here. Yeah, so this is the area which had the privet hedge here, and then the fence. And you can see we've still got, as a point of reference, we've still got this awful telegraph pole. I think that's something we're going to have to learn to live with, but ultimately it would be lovely if we could have it moved, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. Now this area we've put box hedging. Again, a lot of these were just small cuttings, and again the cuttings of the Nepeta has just infilled this area, and it really didn't cost anything. So you can make lots of plants for free. You don't need a budget to do it, but you do need patience. So this area was a bit of a design challenge because we had a large electric box which feeds our, got a large kind of septic tank area which it does need an electric supply. So it was situated on our land. So what that meant was the path led to this big ugly monstrosity. So we couldn't hide it, it was too big, so we had to pay to have that removed. So that was a large cost, but we did that in 2013, and then that allowed us to finish off this part of the patio. And this area again, we decided to move the seating area from down there where it was too windy to up here, but because it hadn't been designed with that in mind, it was quite small, so it was okay if there was just 4 of us, but if any other family members came it was just a bit cramped. So we've relocated it elsewhere, and we just use this area to put pots, and I really like it. And we've got the trellis, and it's covered nicely now, it's really matured, and yeah, it's quite fun just to play around with different pots and things, and see what way we can have it to make it look at its best each year. So as I said, we had this large privet hedge which backed this border, and it was good in that it was a nice green backdrop. It was scruffy when we moved in, but we cut it, Alistair cut it, and he used to do it sort of 2-3 times a year. It grows very quickly, and it did for a while look quite good, although there was a bit of a patch, a holy patch in it. So we bought some more privet to sort of infill that, and I think in doing so we introduced some disease, and the next thing the whole hedge, or half the hedge, just died. So we were a bit flummoxed as to what to do, because we kind of built the design around this hedge, and as I said, that was the end of our garden. And we've got a lot of open countryside here behind us, and the winds just rolling off that off the fields, and we get really high winds that come in and just flatten everything. So by removing the hedge, we were leaving ourselves open to the elements, but we just felt it had to go, so we took it out, and at the same time we, or shortly afterwards, we put in the yew hedge. I think that was in 2014. So the yew hedge has been absolutely excellent. It's growing surprisingly quickly, and it's so dense, and it really is a great wind buffer. It really slows the winds down. And the nice thing is, because the hedge used to be at the back of the planting, the roots would impact and dry out the borders, whereas now the hedging is quite separate, and I quite like that because it just means I don't have the problems with it absorbing a lot of the moisture from the plants. So after we put in the pathways, we had these little kind of pencil-like borders running alongside them. It's something I guess most of us do when we're just learning and just new to gardening, is you put in these sort of narrow borders. But over time, the borders got bigger and bigger, and then we took the brave decision of completely changing the whole layout, and we cut out this square, and it looks so much better. And we've got these 4 quadrants. And again, we've tried to make this into a zone in itself, and we're going to do something different there. So it's constantly that feeling of closing in and then opening up to reveal something beyond. And that's what makes a garden exciting and enticing, and somewhere where you want to explore. So we felt quite strongly from quite early on that the Georgian architecture should reflect the design of the garden. And early on we did put in some sort of curved pathways and things, and we quickly realised that just didn't seem to sit right with the house. It didn't look right. The Georgian style is obviously great symmetry, very square, the lovely little square Georgian windows, and I think by keeping that square and symmetrical design, that really makes the garden work well with the property. I wouldn't advocate squares and straight lines in every property, but in this instance it definitely works with our property. So one of the things when you're new to gardening is that you see a plant and you like it, and you buy it and you pop it in, and that's great, and you end up with a sort of garden full of lots of itty bitty planting, lots of spot planting, something there, something there, something there, too much, too many things. And I think we're all guilty of that. I think that's just what we all do when we're new to gardening. And I wouldn't look at it as a mistake, because the advantage of that is that you have you try out lots of different plants, you find out which ones you like and which ones do well in your garden. And then with that in mind, you can then sort of rejig things, move things around, multiply the plants that you like, get rid of the ones you don't like, and just hone the area with your experience as it grows. So I have got lots of plants here, and over time I am getting better at sort of perfecting the style and knowing what things are. I think often in the winter when things die back, you think, what on earth is that? Can't remember. So keeping notes and making little records of what it is you want to do in the autumn, because there's lots to do and lots of things to move. So definitely worth keeping a notebook on hand, and even doing videos like this one is always very helpful. So this area, as you can see, the grass is awful, and it happens every year that the hot weather comes, the plants, everything's looking lovely in the garden, and the grass really lets it down. We're on this very, very dry, sandy soil, and this is the original grass that was here when we moved in, and it's very stressed, very old, and if we were to keep it, it would need completely replacing. So for that reason, I just feel that this area would benefit from some other types of grass, not the traditional grass, but other grasses that can be more naturalistic and better really from a sort of environmental point of view, but also from a maintenance point of view, just grasses that can grow up and look nice all year round. So once we created the sort of quadrant area over here, this area suddenly became quite awkward looking and just doesn't look right. So this grass, which is pretty much dead, is coming out. We're going to take this out, and we've got a whole new area that we're going to do. And I want to have an area, this is quite windy here, and I want to sort of emphasize the wind by having plants that look good when they're blowing in the wind. And I also want something, because when you're in the house, something that looks good all year round. So we need a bit of structure, we need a bit of height. So that's something that we're going to be working on in the months to come. I do find, we find that we just don't get anything structural done in the summer months because it's just so busy. We've got, grass cutting and all the plants and everything to see to. We both work full time, and there's just very little time to push on with the garden. But in the autumn, we suddenly get a little bit more downtime, or not downtime, but time to do the garden. So that's when I actually find it quite exciting. That's when the big things happen. So this area, when we moved in here, there was no fence to speak of at all down this way. So it was just completely open to the driveway and to the neighbours, which are on this side. So the first thing we did was to put a fence in, 6-foot fence. But there was a neighbour's property, the window just looked directly into the garden, which we didn't really like. So we thought about how we needed some sort of tree or something, trees that are a bit higher, just to block out that view. So again, me making lots of mistakes and learning along the way, I bought these cherry trees and thought, I'll have one of each. I tried all these different varieties of cherries and I planted them. And it quickly became obvious that this was the wrong choice. It looked silly, they were all different and they just didn't really block out the view. So they're the cherries that we moved up to the vegetable patch. So in their place, we, having looked at magazines, and really good place to get lots of ideas, are looking through garden magazines, and my favourite is one called The English Garden, and it's full of beautiful gardens. It's quite aspirational, but gives you lots of good ideas which you can use for your own garden. So we looked at, I thought maybe pleach trees would be good, and I considered different varieties, and the two that I kind of settled on was, one was lime and the other was hornbeam. I ruled out lime because sometimes it produces a bit of a sticky sap, and I thought with this being a pathway, I didn't want the sap on the pathway. So I settled on hornbeam. So once we'd put in all the pathway, and this pathway we deliberately made quite wide because we thought the plants will spill onto the pathway and we didn't want it to be sort of narrow. So it is a deliberately big pathway. So the hornbeam went in, and because we didn't know how to begin to pleach hornbeam, we bought it already pleached on a frame. The difficulty with that was it was very unwieldy, very heavy. It came from Wales, a garden centre in Wales, which is growing on clay, and it was so incredibly heavy. So we had a real job to get this in, but which we managed it, and we put in a row of 10. So that was good, and it blocked out, and very quickly it's filled in, and it's a lovely backdrop, and it really does work for the privacy. But it kind of looked quite obvious that we were using it to block something, so we thought it would be far better to make it more balanced, to make it an avenue of trees. So we decided to do the same on this side. Only this time, because when Alistair has got very good at pleaching, he does it all, he does it beautifully. So we decided to do it ourselves. So we built the framework, the children all helped, and we bought the trees, and they were so much cheaper. They were very cheap to buy, and they came as just tall standard trees. We stripped off all the leaves at the bottom, we planted them, which was a lot easier than the ones on the frame, and then we put the frame in afterwards. So the effect is just as good, just the same. I think some of the trunk is a bit knobbly, but I think over time that won't matter. So yeah, they're starting to fill in, and we'll soon have a very similar effect as on this side. So for us, that's worked really well. Thank you so much for watching part 1 of this video, in which we looked at how we transformed the lower part of our garden. Join us again in next week's video when we look at how we transformed a field, effectively a large open space, into more intimate zones to give a sort of garden room appearance. Join us again, and see you next time. Bye for now.